And hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy week to come to this session. My goal is to make it as useful a session for you as possible. Maybe you could just drop into the chat your department that you work for and maybe a little goal statement for today, like what you came here to learn, and we'll try to make sure that we hit those goals. All right, I have put a link into the chat for you. The first one accidentally got sort of messed up, so don't use the first link, but the second link should work. And it'll take you to a Google Drive that has some information, like some resources for you, including the presentation that I'm going to give today, as well as some example rubrics and assignments and things like that. So we're actually going to use that in a few minutes, so feel free to open up that link. Okie dokie. I think I'll share my screen. So let me work on that here while you guys introduce yourselves. Okay. And slideshow, hoping it will let me do the regular slideshow. All right. Can you see my screen? All right, cool. Great. So we're here to talk about introduction to rubrics, what, when, where, and why. The photos that I've selected here to show you are to give you sort of a taste of what you might use a rubric for. So we can use a rubric to evaluate student performance when they actually give a presentation or do an activity, some kind of task that they do in real life that you observe. We can use a rubric, of course, to mark student papers. If we have them create an infographic or a video or something like that, we can use rubrics for all of these different types of purposes. So the variety is huge. So in terms of the what and the when and the where, I think rubrics are highly applicable to a variety of assignments. And okay, so our objective today is for you to actually develop a reliable and valid rubric for one of your courses. So for one of the assignments in one of your courses, we're going to be going through the process of how you might create a rubric. Now, it's quite possible that you're already using rubrics. That's wonderful. And maybe this presentation will just give you some new things to think about, or maybe some new strategies for how to conceive of your rubrics. For those who are just joining, I put a link into the chat to a Google Drive folder that has some resources for you, and some of the resources we're going to use here in just a moment. So I recommend opening that up if you can, please. You might be familiar with Bloom's taxonomies, or Bloom's taxonomy of learning, or Bloom's cognitive taxonomy is sometimes called. So Benjamin Bloom created this heuristic of how to think about levels of thinking when we're learning. So here we have the original version in 1956 and the updated version from 2001. They're very similar. And the idea here is that the base level is going to be like the most rudimentary or basic level of thinking. So if you're remembering facts, you can see that's here at the base, remembering facts. That's going to be like the most sort of basic level of thinking. And as you move up through the pyramid, the thinking becomes more sophisticated, understanding, so comprehending things. So let's think about if we were studying history. Remember would be like remembering facts, remembering events, remembering dates. Understanding would be like understanding the relationship between those facts. Applying might be applying a theoretical framework to understand, to better understand what transpired. If we're analyzing or synthesizing, we're taking the information apart or putting it back together. And then evaluating, of course, is we're making a value judgment about something that happened. And then creation, it's interesting, I think, that creation is at the top of the pyramid. So that means that, according to Bloom, creation is the pinnacle of sophisticated thinking, right? But it can be challenging to evaluate, I think. So rubrics can definitely come into play there. I have this quote from Daniel Willingham at the bottom. Memory is the residue of thought. So if we want our students to retain the information that we're presenting in our courses, we try to give them these opportunities to critically think And so if we're up in the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy, that's more in the critical thinking, the deeper thinking, students are more likely to remember the things that they are learning at these higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, so we're going to start our hands-on work here in just a second. I want to talk with you here about some different options for the types of assignments that you might use in your courses when you want to use a rubric or apply a rubric. So on the left-hand side, we have the constructed response. So constructed response tends to be something that the students construct and then they turn it into you and you evaluate it based on a rubric or a set of criteria. Often this is like an essay, or it could be an infographic, or some kind of, you know, a collage. It could be both graphic or written. Okay, that's a constructed response. On the right-hand side, performance-based is about doing things in the moment, i.e. making a presentation, or if there was a lab that you were actually observing, that kind of thing. And you're assessing and evaluating their performance right there in the moment. Both of these sort of types of assignments, the constructed response and performance-based response, they elicit deeper thinking than a multiple choice assessment, okay? So when we think about Bloom's taxonomy, these are going to elicit definitely thinking that is at a higher level than a multiple choice test. Both involve students creating a product, and student created videos, which is one of my favorite types of assignments. These are sort of in between the constructed response and the performance-based, okay? Because they are doing a performance and it's capturing in real time, but it's also something that they turn into you that you can assess, you know, at a later date. Okay, so we're going to take a moment here and it's your turn. So think of a learning objective in your course. So think it could be any of the courses that you're teaching. Think of one learning objective and choose the level of Bloom's taxonomy that you wish to assess. So for this, let me see if I can go to our drive. Yeah. So this is the link that I shared in the chat, and you can open up Bloom's taxonomy verbs. And there are two links in Bloom's taxonomy verbs that will actually take you to sort of a hierarchy of, of verbs that relate to different levels of Bloom's. Okay, so you can see actually this one is based on the old Bloom's because it stops up here at evaluation, and that's totally fine, don't worry. The idea is thinking, you know, maybe up here in this upper range, what is something that you want students to be able to do? What's the objective? And we want to use one of these verbs to convey that objective. And let me open the other link. That was the first one. Here's the second one. And this is based on the new Bloom's, okay? Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create. So we're trying to think up here in the upper level of Bloom's taxonomy, okay? So you're choosing the level of Bloom's and you can state the learning objective with an action verb. So the student will analyze, the student will create, the student will synthesize, for example, okay? And I'd also like you to describe the task that you'd like students to do. Okay, so I'm going to pause here with these instructions on the screen. Whoops. And give you guys a minute. And also I'm going to open up the chat and see if there's any questions and also read what you guys wrote for your intros. Okay. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, if anyone is feeling brave and would like to share the learning objective that they wish to assess with a rubric and the task that they would like the students to do in the chat, that would be great. Okay, bye, Amy. No problem. So I'll give you guys another like 2 minutes. All right, does anyone want to share their thinking so far? I would love to hear from anyone. And feel free to just unmute yourself and dive right in. No problem, Niyati, no problem. Everyone's so busy. Very understandable. Okay, well, I'm going to move on, and if at any time you want to share, oh, please go ahead.
So it doesn't seem there are too many of us here.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, you've asked us to formulate an assignment based on these steps.
Yes.
I haven't really thought much of these steps in the past. I'm from physics.
Yeah,
And I can just describe like an assignment that we've done,
please.
and maybe you can help me parse how to frame it in this framework. Like, so for example, it's a computational physics course, so they have to learn some algorithms for solving equations, particular equations, and they have to translate those algorithms into working code on a computer. So learn the algorithms, learn how to code them, debug, and then solve a physics problem, and then generalize the problem into something more interesting than the original one, add some complicating factor, and then try to draw a relation between observables.
Wonderful.
So how does a rock fly through the air? Okay, they've solved that now. Now they're going to add something interesting like air resistance. And now they're going to say, well, how does the maximum height vary with the air resistance? And so how does that fit? How does what I just described fit into
Right.
the framework?
Well, I think if we think about maybe one high level objective that you think, or maybe two objectives that might sort of encompass the activities that you described. So we're sort of trying to think about the thinking skills in physics that students that they're applying. So they are, they're translating, it sounds like they're translating the physics concepts to code, right?
Mhm.
And then they're applying the code to a sophisticated problem, maybe something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that those would be, those might be sort of a high level objectives that you could state. And it's always helpful for students to actually state those objectives. So they're like, oh, okay, like that's what I'm learning today. And these are the tasks that are going to help me learn those objectives, right?
Okay. But those two things that you just pointed out, translating into code and applying the code to a problem, those seem like low level
Do they?
things. I think so.
I don't know.
Like just learning something and learning how to apply it. It just seemed to me that the higher Bloom things were like,
Well, the translation might be a lower level. Translation is maybe more sort of in the, the understanding and remembering level of Bloom's. But
okay.
application is in the upper range of thinking skills for sure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Great questions. Thank you so much. And I'm going to move on with a couple more, like some other ways for us to conceive of these learning objectives. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay. I do want to say, I have my little notes here. I suggest short activities, short tasks. I personally am not a big fan of the even 10-page paper, let alone 20-page paper. I have gotten my best responses from students, my absolute best responses from students when I limit my assignments to only about 1,200 words because they have to write concisely. They know they have to squeeze a lot into the 1,200 words. And so I don't get dribble drabble, right? Students learn to write concisely, which for me is such an important skill. So I just wanted to mention that you do not need to have these enormous assignments, right, to successfully assess the objectives. All right. So within your learning objective, you might have some different, or you will likely have different facets, sort of aspects of that objective. And I think that Yvonne, or is it Ivan or Yvonne? Sorry.
I prefer Yvonne.
Yvonne, thank you. Great. Even what we heard Yvonne's example, there are multiple facets to what he described, right? So I'd like you to brainstorm some of the facets of your objective. And within that, within each facet, what are some observable indicators of success? So as you're thinking about yours, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. So I'm in education, and my students are often asked to write a literature review. And the skills that are being assessed as they write the literature review are research skills and writing skills. So I have here the overarching objective is that they're learning research and writing skills as evidenced by writing a literature review. And then I have these four aspects that, or four like key skills that comprise the overarching objective. And those are locating relevant literature, right? So database searches, that kind of thing. Summarizing and synthesizing the information, organizing the findings, and then presenting clear communication. So one of the sort of typical practices that I do see sometimes is that we end up focusing a lot on this clear communication part in students' writing and a little bit less on the content. So I try to parse out the communication as its own unique aspect of the literature review, but really I'm interested in the content. I'm interested in what they're thinking, right? So just to walk you through briefly, some sort of look-fors, I guess you could say, among the locating relevant literature would be, is the literature relevant, of a high quality? Did they find enough literature? And is the range appropriate? When they are summarizing or synthesizing, did they get the key information from the articles? Did they compare and contrast the findings? And did they identify any existing tensions? And then in organizing the findings, did they create a clear and logical order across the whole piece within each paragraph? And do they have a good introduction and conclusion? And then the communication piece will be, what we think about as like the language, I guess, the more surface level language skills, grammar, spelling, use of transition words, and clearly written sentences. So these would be what I look for in a written literature review. And here, maybe back to Yvonne's original question. What if we wanted to evaluate their lab in a STEM field? So this would be a very large objective, obviously, scientific inquiry skills, evidenced by performing a STEM lab. And I have as the facets safety, inquiry, and design of the experiment, the measurement, analysis, and evaluation, and conclusion, right? So I'm not going to try, because I'm not in the STEM field, I'm not going to try to fill in all of these look-fors, but I think you can envision what they might be. We have technology today, even, simple technology like your phone's camera, right? That can take videos, it can take photos, and we can use that data that students provide us as evidence. So for example, for safety, the students could be taking some photographs of their their actual time in the lab and how they took safety precautions. For example, we don't need to have everything be submitted to us in a written format, right? We can use images and videos and that sort of thing. I'm going to bring you back to this one for a moment and then see if you have any questions. But for those of you who have a teaching assistant, consider which maybe the TA can help with some aspects of this, right? Or they can do a preliminary review. You might not want to leave all of the marking to your TA, but maybe they can focus on a couple of these aspects and then you can focus on a couple of the aspects. So it can be sort of divided up in that way. Okay, let me see if anyone has any questions at this point or comments. Okay. I think that rather than actually us doing this at this point, because this part does take a while, I think I'm going to continue. But like I said, this presentation is in the Google Drive I shared. And if anytime you have questions, if you're trying this out on your own and you want to reach out to me, I would be delighted to chat with you and hear how it's going. Okay? Okay. So when we think about assessment, we're kind of weighing two things. We're weighing the reliability of the assessment and the validity of the assessment. And technically, an assessment has to be reliable in order for it to be valid. But generally speaking, when we talk about reliability, we're talking about getting the same result every time we assess, okay? So actually, the more simplistic the assessment, the more reliable it usually is. And on the other hand, validity is when we're capturing all the key constructs, so that would be like the skills, the knowledge that are relevant to real life and authenticity. So there's a balance between validity and reliability. It's called the attenuation paradox. And it's pretty hard to do both because if you think about it, the more simplistic the assessment is, the more reliable it is, right? Because we know we're going to get the same result every time. And yet the validity is based on how appropriate and relevant is this assessment to real life performance. So we want to try to capture more. It has to be less simplistic. So when we're doing rubrics, we're trying to sort of balance between the validity and reliability. Okay. So getting into sort of the nuts and bolts of rubrics, or continuing with that, we do want the rubric to translate to a score, right? And Memorial provides this set of grading criteria here for, what's an A, B, C, and D. In the graduate programs, we know that students need to have an A or a B in order to continue with the program, right? So they need to have like a 65 or higher in order to continue. So when we design our rubrics, we want to basically keep this in mind and ensure that our rubric basically matches this, because otherwise our rubric is going to be out there assessing but not connecting back to the actual decisions that are being made about students, right? And those decisions that we make about students are basically how we evaluate the how good our assessment is really when it comes down to making those decisions about students and their success. All right, so we need to keep this in mind. We call it a backward design. So there's a couple options when you're making your rubrics. On the right-hand side, I'll start with this one. It's a simpler one. It's called a holistic rubric. And the holistic rubric is basically exactly what it sounds like. You're going to be evaluating it holistically, like as a whole, okay, and applying a level. So here I wrote aspects of an excellent performance because I'm not going to be filling this in. It won't be applicable to everybody, right? But you would be describing what are the aspects of an excellent performance, something that you would, like just think is outstanding. So you actually write that all out and then you ascribe a level of points to it. I think it's really important in rubrics that students can earn 100%. even if we're not giving 100% very often, I think it needs to be possible. So that's, to me, a really important criteria for rubrics. Anyway, so for the holistic, you're kind of doing it all at once, like overall, how did they do? Okay, and I have the sort of the levels as excellent, very good, minimally acceptable, and attempted but not satisfactory. And actually, this should just be good. All right. I don't use holistics rubrics very often because I think it's pretty hard to evaluate things holistically for me, okay? And I think that also students like to have a little more granularity in their feedback. So I use what is called an analytic rubric over here on the left-hand side. This is probably the one that you see more often. And these are the levels that, you know, we'll typically use. Again, level 4 is the excellent, and this will be the maximum number of points, 5 points, okay? And across the 4 aspects, this totals to 20. And if we're going to put it in as a percentage, sorry, this would be 100%, 80%, 60%, and 40% going down, and these numbers all match that, right? I'm demonstrating this one to you because I created this rubric to align with what I just showed you with Memorial's grading criteria, where the upper cusp is of good is the upper cusp of B, okay? So a B for Memorial is 80 and it goes down to 65. And just to keep the math simple here, you know, the bottom of good is a 60. So there's a little bit of wiggle room here, which is not super ideal, but I think that overall this rubric is like, it's simple enough to be clear. And then students who are in this wiggle room area of 65 to 60, you can provide some more nuanced feedback. So it'll help them understand, you know, were they still within the good realm or were they in, you know, barely minimally acceptable? Yeah, and so in Brightspace, you can select any number along the continuum. You don't have to be married to a whole number. And I use decimals all the time in Brightspace, no problem. Okay, so any questions about this? All right.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask, how do you select the specific concepts that you use within the rubric? Because with me, what I do is that my rubric is based on specific topic. So the concepts that are in the rubric are in the topic.
Okay.
And then my comments, I always make sure that the rubric goes with the comments. Because when, maybe it's because I am a quantitative person. So I find marking qualitative very difficult. So now, my rubric is, in the rubric, it's a short form of concepts that aligns with the topic, right? Then I will give the students based on that. So now, let's say, for example, one of the, let's say it's a purpose, the purpose or organization, the student got 0.5 out of 5. So then under comments, I'm going to explain why the student got that comment, that 0.5. And then I'm going to cut from the assignment into that comment so that the student can see that this is the mistake and this is how to correct the mistake and this is where the mistake comes from the assignment. That's how I mark using the rubric.
I see. Okay.
So mine is in detail.
That sounds extremely time
Yes, that's how I do it. And there's no other student since I started teaching here who complains about marks with me. No, because everything is clear in the room. No, there's no student who can complain because it's very clear.
Yeah. Good. Well, that sounds really good. It sounds very time consuming though.
Yes. But once you do it, you get used to it. It's better to take time than to take shortcuts and students come running to you. I don't have time for that.
That's true, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. But to go back to your original, I think your original question was how do you choose sort of the categories for your rubric? Is that right? You were asking that?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends, right, on what are the key objectives that you're trying to teach. So it just, it depends on the sorts of thinking that you want students to do, the sorts of language that you want them to use, right? And so unpacking that objective, which is, let me just go back here. Unpacking the objective, like for example, this is what I use for a literature review. These are the categories, the main categories: locating the literature, summarizing and synthesizing it, organizing the findings, and clearly communicating. For me, those would be the 4 main categories. Yeah, but describing the construct and unpacking the construct is an important part of that validity of the assessment, right? Because like I said, often we're over here on the communication side and we're not actually getting into the critical thinking, and that sort of ends up limiting the validity of our assessment because we're not really assessing the things that matter most. Okay, this is my last sort of slide to present to you, and then I want to give you guys some time to work or ask questions. It's best practice to describe each level of the rubric the best you can. Sometimes you feel like you're just sort of repeating yourself over and over. Like here, I'm just giving one example. Let's just say I was focusing on grammar. So level 4 is worth 5 points. It would be complete control of grammatical structures. Level 3 is worth 4 points. Very strong control. Any errors barely interfere with the message that's trying to be conveyed, and so forth, going down all the way to level 0. I don't always do this, and I think even in the examples that I shared with you in the Google Drive, I don't always do this. And I haven't had too many problems. I think it's most important to articulate the top level, right? Like articulate what the goal is, so students have an understanding of what your expectation is. And if you articulate the other points along the continuum, that's great. But most importantly, they need to know what the expectation is. If you do choose to describe each level, you can use frequency descriptors like here. I mean, this is kind of like a Likert scale, right? Almost always, often, sometimes, seldom, never. So this is like, how frequently. And then you can have quality descriptors over here on the right-hand side, that actually pertain to the quality of the work. Honestly, I find that writing out all of these things sometimes is, it might provide actually students with some cognitive overload, right? So they're like, whoa, that's like so much for me to understand and look at. I'm not sure I want to go there, right? So I will say that it's a bit of a shortcut to not describe each level, but it's worked fine for me. Okay, so here's an example that is taken from one of the assignments that I shared with you in the Google Drive. And this is actually for a video assignment that I just am trying out this semester. I work in the reading development and instruction program, and students go in cohorts through the program, right? And I've had them for a couple of semesters, or I've had at least one section for a couple of semesters, and they've already written like 2 literature reviews in the previous previous courses. And so this time around, I was like, I think they're getting kind of tired of doing literature reviews. It's still really important, but how about we do it in the multimedia format? And so this was the rubric for that. Let me just trying to make it a little bigger for you here. So these are the criteria or the categories here on the left-hand side. Most of it has to do with the content. So the research question itself, was it feasible and appropriate? Did they have the appropriate and right number of pieces of literature that they reviewed? They also created an annotated bibliography. Was it done correctly? And then this is more, I guess, sort of this here, the visual elements and professional presentation is kind of that surface level, like grammar is the surface level of our essays. This is the surface level of the presentation. Like, did it look and sound right? And in no longer than 8 minutes. So again, I am all about the shorter assignments. I think students do better work when they are limited in how long their response can be. And then the largest number of points here was in the presentation, organization, and content. So I am showing you this one because the levels, the maximum points for each of these are all a little bit different, or there's some variation here. And we don't always have to just give the same maximum points. Like some things are more important, right? So this organization and content of the presentation was the most important category. And so it's, you know, twice as many points as some of the other categories. And then finally, they actually gave peer review to a classmate on their videos. We were using the Bongo platform on Brightspace, and I'm just marking these now, and they're turning out really, really well. So I'm super happy. The students did a great job. Okay, so I was going to ask you guys to, you know, if you wanted to work on creating a rubric, and, you know, if you had any questions about it in the rest of the time that we have together, but maybe you'd rather discuss or ask questions at this point. And so I'm just going to open up to anybody. Oh, sorry. Okay. Susan, I'm just going to put the chat, the link in the chat one more time there. Okay, great. So any questions or comments? All right. Well, I know that everyone is like, you guys took the time out of your afternoon to come to this presentation, which is really incredible. I know how busy everybody is. So I'm not going to keep you if you are, if you feel that you had your main questions answered and your goals addressed. I just want to share sort of my conclusion for you here. Rubrics do give students clear criteria against which they can check their work. Okay. Sometimes I feel like the assignments are the only thing I can be sure that students read carefully. So you'll see in the examples that I shared in the Google Drive, some of my assignments are actually really long, and they're much longer than what I used to provide. So I try to provide a rationale, you know, the reason for doing the assignment, that kind of thing, some background information, and lots of instructions, lots of clear instructions. Because I sometimes, like I said, sometimes I feel like this is the only thing I can be sure students are definitely reading. The rubrics help students prioritize their effort. So like on the example that I showed you a moment ago, the proportion of their mark that's attributed to like the content and organization of their presentation was way higher than the other categories. So this tells them that that has to be a priority for them, which is good because I want them to be focused on the content. Rubrics are a chance for you to bring your students into the discipline and to understand the discipline from this insider perspective, which I personally, that's sort of my teaching philosophy, is that we try through our instruction and our assignments to bring students into the fold of the discipline and empower them to basically be able to change the discipline from within, right, and move us along in the field. And rubrics are sort of democratic in that way, where they make everything really clear, transparent, and upfront, and also provide this opportunity to learn about how the discipline thinks, how the discipline does things, and also how we talk to each other. But importantly, rubrics are not a substitute for clear instructions, so we can't say no instructions and just give a rubric. We have to give instructions as well, and sort of think of it as like the bookends of the assignment. They get the instructions, they get the rubric, and with that, they're well prepared to do their very best work on the assignment and show what they know. Okay, I am going to stop there, and I'm here to hear any questions or discussion. Okay.
We have
Great,
a very
Stacey.
quiet. We have
Yeah.
a very quiet bunch. I'm sorry, Jean, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Oh, no,
We,
no, no.
we,
Well,
for anyone that joined a little late, just want to let you know that this is going to be recorded or is being recorded. So Jean, I'm sorry, did you want to go ahead? Was there anything else you wanted to add before I concluded for you?
No,
or-
I think I just wanted to welcome Jane. I don't know if I saw Jane earlier, so hello. And there's a link that's been put in the chat, Jane, if you'd like to access it, with some resources about today's presentation. And yeah, I am really passionate about assessment. So if anyone is interested in following up with me, I guess I'll put my email in the chat, and happy to connect with you. Thank you so much, Darlene.